Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to the Genshin Impact 5.2 meta roundup. Compared to last Abyss, there's a few things that are better, there's a few things that are worse, and there's a lot to talk about. But before we get into it, let me just quickly explain how the meta roundup works now. Every new Abyss change, for about a week, I collect Abyss video submissions from people who want to contribute. I collect that data and the videos after announcing it on a community post on YouTube, announcing it on the Discord and on stream. And once I've compiled that data, I use that and my understanding of the Abyss to talk about the characters that are doing particularly well, the characters that are getting a little bit countered, and all that good stuff. And if you want to help contribute to the next meta roundup, keep an eye out. The Abyss changes are always on the 16th of each month, and usually, like I said, I collect data for about a week. So first chamber, we have the consecrated Hydro Beast on the first wave, and then on the second wave you have two eroding avatars of lava. These are the ones that do geo damage. It's a little like misleading because there's lava in the name, but both the geo and the pyro one have lava in the name. The eroding is the geo one and the fluid is the pyro one. On the second half, you have a first wave of two Tapetlosaurus, followed by the experimental field generator. This is not the same thing as the gravitational enhanced mech or whatever it's called. This is not the thing that gets a shield and that you have to plunge a break or use blunt attack. This doesn't get a shield whatsoever. Chamber 2, on the first half, you have a Dendro Consecrated Beast, followed by one of the new Nutland enemies, the Secret Source Automaton Hunter Seeker. And then the second half, you have Aeon Blight Drake. And then Chamber 3, you have the first wave consisting of two Fluid Avatars of Lava. These are the ones that are Pyro. The Fluid Avatars of Lava, unlike the eroding ones, have an innate aura. They have an innate Pyro aura, which means that you can't have any other element as an aura. They'll always be affected by Pyro, which means you can use that to trigger reactions, but it can also prevent you from triggering reactions, depending on which reactions you're talking about. And then the second wave, you have the Eremite Stone Enchanter, with the second half being the Tulpa. Now, this Abyss cycle has a higher HP multiplier than the last time we had Tulpa in Abyss, right? So the HP multiplier for this Spiral Abyss cycle is 300%, which means that the Tulpa has almost 4 million HP. This is pretty high, to the point where it becomes a lot harder to justify playing teams that aren't really optimal for the Tulpa. The Tulpa will be the chamber you're probably going to have to build around. I would say that chambers 1 and 2 are honestly not too difficult, as long as you have a way to knock down the Aeon Blight Drake from his flight, which can be done either with a bow user or with certain non-bow user abilities that can hit this. Or if you don't need to knock it down, you don't necessarily, like, if you can hit it without knocking it down, you don't necessarily need to. Anyways, one more thing I want to mention before we get directly into the characters themselves is that patch 5.2 has brought buffs to certain elemental reactions. So they buffed Superconduct, Electrocharge, Overloaded, and Shatter. The Shatter buff is big, but Shatter was so bad that it didn't matter. The Electrocharge buff is pretty sizable, but there aren't many teams where Electrocharge is that large of a portion of the damage. The Superconduct buffs are massive, but Superconduct, just like Shatter, was so bad that it kind of doesn't end up mattering. And finally, the actual important one is the Overload buff. Now, Overloaded got the smallest buff out of all of them. However, Overload had the highest base damage out of all of them, and there are actually characters that are built around a decent amount of Overload damage. And because of that, Overload is by far the most impactful one of the changes. Now you might be thinking, okay, but it doesn't really matter because you're never really building around Overload itself. Overload is generally just a byproduct of something else, right? You're getting Overload in a Chevreuse team because you want to get the res shred, not because you care about the Overload damage. You're getting Overload in Raiden National team because you're vaping and you're also getting free overloads on top of that. Well, in truth, there were already before the buff a few teams where it was worth a consideration to go either full EM or hybrid with a good amount of EM on your overload trigger. The one I've talked about on this channel before is full EM Raiden on Chevreuse teams as a brain dead option for pyro carries that want to have good uptime, like 100% uptime on their Chevreuse resistance shred, but don't want to have to focus too much on making sure Oz uptime is great, because obviously Raiden's skill lasts for much, much longer. And if that's what you're doing, because Raiden's electro application is a bit slower, she's not going to become the aura, she's going to stay as the trigger, so her EM is what's going to be looked at for reactions. And if you're not using her burst, then you'd rather build her full EM than full attack. However, the teams that got the biggest buffs from these changes are teams that I don't think I've actually talked about on this channel before. And those are teams where you use full EM Xiangling as your overload trigger. Because in those teams, you get a much larger amount of overloads from Xiangling, right? Obviously, Xiangling applies much more pyro than Raiden applies electro if you're looking at their off-field application only. Even if you look at their on-field application, it's pretty close. But with the recent changes, right, we can trigger a 35-ish K overload in a team like this, or more realistically, right, if you're playing in Chevreuse teams, which are the ones I'm mentioning right now. Right, 26K, 32K, 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 and this is with a build that isn't even on Kitane or Dragon Blade, like this is with Fav. As it turns out, if you're playing a team like this where you're not using Bennett, even if you build Xiangling on a default build, her Pyronado is going to do a decent amount less damage than that 32K you're getting from the overload. Which means that so long as Xiangling gets a high enough amount of overloads, as long as you're maintaining your Electro aura well enough, she'll deal more damage with EM than with the traditional build. All in all, I think these teams are honestly not bad. Honestly, like they're fairly good teams. I've enjoyed using them a decent amount. For this specific Abyss, however, there are issues with a team like this on both sides. Both of them in Chamber 3. The first issue is with the Fluid Avatar of Lava. This guy has an innate Pyro aura, which means that Xiangling can never trigger a reaction on it, because you can't apply Electro as an aura to them. Which means that if you build her full EM, she does no damage against these guys. On top of that, they also have high power resistance, which definitely doesn't help. And the second potential issue is with the Tulpa. And here it's not really an issue, it's more just the fact that against Tulpa, you're guaranteed vapes, and you're guaranteed more than one hit per spin of Xiangling's Pyronado, which means that the amount of damage that Xiangling does, if you're building her on the traditional build, is much, much higher than it is against other enemies, and so you have more of an incentive of keeping her on a traditional build instead of swapping her to an EM build. Anyways, I wanted to quickly touch on these changes because I think that people are sleeping on full EM Xiangling a little bit right now. I don't think she's like an amazing option in any of these teams, but she's actually reasonably good, and characters built full EM tend to be a little bit easier to get built relatively well, right? The threshold for quote-unquote good artifact investment is lower, and so if you're struggling, that's something you could potentially consider. So, let's talk about some interesting data that I got from my collection. Keep in mind, Abyss data isn't necessarily representative of character strength. Just because a character is played more doesn't necessarily mean they're better, and just because a character is played less doesn't necessarily mean they're worse. What this tells us is how popular they are. On top of that, it doesn't tell us how popular the character is as a whole, it tells us how popular a character is within my audience, out of people that care about Abyss enough to record their footage and submit it. So please don't take any of this data and use it to extrapolate how strong a character is. However, that doesn't mean there's nothing interesting to gain from data like this. So let's talk about it. The usual very popular characters are still very popular. Farina, very popular. Nahida, pretty damn popular. Yelan, quite popular. Kazuha, somewhat popular. Xiangling, obviously very popular. Fischl, very popular. Bennett, very popular. No real surprise there. But there are a few things that are maybe a bit surprising for some of you. So Neuvillette, not too popular. Although I suspect that part of that is because people just don't want to submit the same Neuvillette team that a bunch of other people have already submitted. I think that he's probably played a bit more than is represented here. Obviously though, as you can see, he has not played second side at all because of Tulpa. I think the biggest outlier here is probably Chevreuse, who is actually incredibly popular this Abyss, and 98% of people play her on the second side. And there's a good reason for that. It's because of Tulpa. Tulpa is an enemy that gives you free vapes and has an innate aura that can potentially prevent a lot of your setups. Chevreuse teams would benefit a lot from vaping but can't run Hydro units, and can apply all their buffs and debuffs independently of enemy aura. Which means Pyro carries and Chevreuse teams are pretty much the best matchup for Tulpa. That's why Chevreuse is being so overrepresented in this Abyss compared to usual. She's not actually that much more popular than the previous Abyss, but that's because the previous Abyss also had a pretty strong incentive for Chevreuse teams by having a lot of Geo Shields that can easily be broken by Overload. Fischl is also somewhat of an outlier in the sense that she's used a lot. And honestly, I think that kind of makes sense because Fischl is an integral part of many of the second side teams that are very, very good in this Abyss. When you look at the sort of stuff that does well against Tulpa, and we're talking about Tulpa specifically because it's by far the hardest chamber. When you look at the stuff that's good against Tulpa, there's a bunch of stuff that kind of gets ruled out. All the vape teams can be good against Tulpa, but whatever Hydro character you use is going to be completely worthless. They're not going to do anything because Tulpa is immune to Hydro damage. Melt teams, Cryo melt teams, won't be able to melt, and Pyro melt teams will vape instead of melting, so they're going to be worse. Mono Pyro teams can be good. Hyperbloom teams, your Hydro unit isn't going to do much. Aggravate teams, instead of triggering Aggravate, are going to effectively become Hyperbloom teams, and the Electrocharge buff is going to be a pretty big deal in those teams against the Tulpa, because the fact that Tulpa has an innate Hydro aura means that every time you apply a new source of Electro, you'll be triggering Electrocharge, right? You won't be able to get the Quicken aura, but in exchange for that, you'll get a bunch of Electrocharge triggers with much higher base damage than it had before patch 5.2. Any team that uses Farina is going to perform a bit worse because, you know, Farina's damage itself isn't gonna be there. And that leaves you in a situation where the real outliers for the teams that are gonna do very well this Abyss, in the second side at least, are Mono Pyro, Chevreuse teams, and Aggravate teams. Aggravate / pseudo Hyperbloom on the third one. You also have some teams that at least don't get nerfed by the Tulpa, like Navia teams, for example. Navia teams will also be fairly alright. Xiao teams often tend to run Farina, and Plunge teams in general don't have a bad matchup against Tulpa, but they do kind of feel like ass because Tulpa's hitbox is very big and in a weird shape. And so very often, if you're standing too close to the Tulpa, you'll try to jump and then you'll just hit your head on the ceiling, and then you're not going to be able to plunge, which is cringe. Wanderer teams will do fairly well as long as you're doing Wanderer teams that aren't using Farina, but you will have to be careful because Wanderer tends to be pretty damn squishy. All that being said, if you're looking at the main three archetypes that I mentioned at the start, Mono Pyro, Chevreuse, and Aggravate teams. Aggravate teams always run Fischl. Mono Pyro teams, while great against the Tulpa, have more difficulty fitting in a bow user that can take down the Aeon Blight Drake. Linny Mono Pyro will do well. Yoimiya, technically, even though she's not great, but like, whatever. And when you're looking at Chevreuse teams, while you usually have a bunch of different Chevreuse teams you can do, because of Tulpa, Pyro carries will do better than Electro carries, because Electro carries don't gain that much from Tulpa being innate Hydro, whereas Pyro carries gain an insane amount. And so you generally want to run Pyro carries with an Electro off-fielder. And when you're looking at the Electro off-fielders, how many of them are bow users? There's Sarah technically, but like, why would you want to play Sarah ever? So that leaves you with Fischl. Which means that both in Aggravate and both in Aggravate and Overloaded, which are going to be two of the better archetypes for the second side of this Abyss, Fischl is like almost always going to be there. I'm guessing that's why she's seeing such a high popularity compared to usual. Fischl is a great character that can fit in a lot of teams, but very often she's not the only option for your team. And so her general popularity doesn't tend to be this high. That being said, whereas Fischl is a character that is incredibly popular this Abyss because she is great in a lot of the different teams that are good this Abyss, Xiangling is popular this Abyss because she's probably the character that is just the best overall in this Abyss. Tulpa is just too good for Xiangling. Xiangling's Pyronado doesn't necessarily only hit once per spin. It deals damage when it comes into contact with enemies with a cooldown. But if the Pyronado is still in contact with the enemy when the cooldown is over, it'll deal its damage again. Which means that against very large enemies, like many of the bosses, it can hit more than once per spin. Specifically against Tulpa, the fact that you're hitting more and you're applying more pyro will never make you lose your Hydro Aura, so all of those hits are going to react, which means that she is going to be dealing an insane amount of damage. This Abyss is, and I can't believe these words are about to come out of my mouth, not great for Xingqiu, honestly. Which is reflected in his relatively low usage rate. The fact that Xingqiu's value doesn't just come from his offensive utility means that he will still see some play. Even in the second half against Tulpa, he's still usable as a defensive utility option that allows you to also vape on the other chambers. But these guys having very high power resistance makes vape teams a bit less good on the first side. And there being 2-unit waves means that Xingqiu's mostly single target application isn't necessarily the best. When you're looking at first side teams, ideally what you want is a team that has pretty good AoE but also good single target. You don't want a team that is only able to do like great AoE damage, but if your team is entirely single target, you might end up struggling as well. The main like good characters I'd look for first side this Abyss are like Neuvillette, Xiao. You can play the pyro carries even despite these guys' high power resistance, because if you have a good team against Tulpa, you can get through it without too much of a problem. Because Aeon Light Drake requires a bow user, Elon can fulfill that same role as Xingqiu of like enabling you to play a vape team that is still functional on chambers 1 and 2. But she's a bow user, so she can take down the Unlight Drake. Pyro plungers like Deluge with Xianyun or Gaming are gonna be good against Tulpa if you build your team for Tulpa, but they're gonna be ass against the rest. Because if you're building your team for Tulpa, it means you're not using Hydro units, which means you're not getting reactions on your plunges in chambers 1 and 2, which is gonna be ass. And if you are using Hydro units, then it's gonna be a bit more rough against Tulpa. Other than that, Hyperloom's teams still do pretty well. Mualani teams don't have the best matchup against the Hydro Consecrated Beast, but are pretty good against the rest, and so they're still fairly solid this Abyss. Chaska teams, which we can talk about because Chaska is a recent release. Chaska teams have a fine time this Abyss. In the second side, if you use Tulpa's weird hitbox to like kind of climb it without having to press space to go up in your skill, you can kind of go high enough that you won't really get hit by its attacks. But it can be a bit of a pain in the ass to do that, and if you don't, since Chaska is pretty much always played with Bennett, and since her defensive stats are really ass, you are very vulnerable to just dying. In my experience, Chaska hasn't felt the best on the second side. On the first side, she feels pretty alright. She is a single target character, so the 2-unit waves of the Avatars of Lava, but the eroding and the fluid ones are annoying, but the Blessing of the Abyssal Moon gives you a lot of attack percent if you're a charge attack user, and Chaska is the one that stacks it the fastest. And so even if it can be a bit of a pain in the ass, because she gets buffed so much by the Abyssal Blessing, she's still fairly good. Other characters that get significantly buffed by the Abyssal Blessing are Linny. Linny is pretty good this Abyss. Obviously, charge attack users that need to stand in Bennett Burst against Tulpa tend to be hard to play, but he's strong enough that because just the fact that he's a bow user means he can take this down. Monopyro teams are great this Abyss, and he's a charge attack user, so he can take advantage of the Blessing quite well. Other than that, Hu Tao is alright, but obviously she doesn't gain as much from attack percent as a lot of other carries do. Arlecchino is alright. She gets 1 charge attack, not multiple, so it's only 20% attack, but at least it's better than 0. Is there any other character? I guess Noel, but similar issue to Hu Tao where it's just not that much. Tefnutty, but also similar issue because he has a split damage scaling of EM and attack, so just an attack buff isn't that amazing. That's pretty much it. Now we are going to do an Abyss clear, talk about each wave individually, some tips. So, first wave, you start with the Hydro Consecrated Beast. It has a few different attacks it can do. Some of them are melee attacks, some of them are range. Range attacks can either be him like starting to move towards you, or him shooting at you from afar. So as a general rule, because one of his attacks is shooting at you from afar, I wouldn't really recommend trying to bait him towards the next wave, especially because it takes a while. Right? If you had to group, then that would be a fine strategy to use, but because you don't have to group at the start, then I don't really recommend doing that. His starting attacks, he has 2 different ones he can do. He can either do a 2-hit combo that makes him do a side spin, or he can do a 4-hit combo. The 2-hit combo doesn't make him move too much. The 4-hit combo makes him move a lot. so staying in the right position is going to be a pretty big deal. So this is the 2-hit combo. He still moves a decent amount, honestly. But when he does that one, there's very little you can do to try to keep him in a specific position. Yeah. But this one, as long as you try to stay around the same position, he'll pretty much come back to you. Be careful though, because the hits on that one tend to do a decent amount of damage. And then finally, after he's been alive for a while, I think it's about 40 seconds, sometimes a bit faster if you reach certain HP thresholds. A little bit over 30. He does this attack, which spawns multiple circles, one in the middle, then one outwards. And then after that, it spawns this thing, which you can hit to knock him down. If you hit it with Hydro, it'll one-shot it. Other elements, it'll take a bunch of attacks. I'm not sure if it's 6 or 8, but it's a decent amount. So if you don't have a great team that can kill him very fast, if you're, for example, playing a team that does a lot of Hydro damage against this guy who has a lot of Hydro resistances, you might have to actually make him live long enough that he'll get that. But if you do break the little thing he spawns, he takes a good amount of damage and his resistances go down for a while. Here, I'm weaving some charge attacks into my usual Shao combo, because the charge attack gives you the blessing gives you attack when you do charge attacks. Second wave is these guys. If you're far away from them at the start, they'll run towards you, so it's pretty easy to group them. And they don't really move much, so as long as you don't die to them, there's really not too much to say. After that, you have 2 Debitless Swords at the start. They're pretty squishy and easy to kill, so there's really not much to say against them. Once you kill them, this guy spawns, and be careful because after like a few seconds after spawning, he like disappears for a bit. This can be dangerous if you use Arlecchino's E as he disappears, because then you just miss and the mark doesn't apply and you have to wait 30 seconds and you're just sitting there like, oh no, what have I done? But there's really not much else to say. You can do plunges for free here if you want, but it's not necessary. You can just do what you want. Then, Chamber 2. You have a Dendro Consecrated Beast. This guy is really annoying. A lot of his attacks make him move backwards, which means that it's generally hard to keep him in one spot. He has a 2-hit combo here, and a 3-hit combo that pretty much start the same way. For the 3-hit combo, he does this, right? He does a backspin at the end like that. And then eventually he'll do this, which is the same thing as the Hydro one. He'll spawn his Dendro Core. And you can break it to spread his resistances and deal damage to him. His attack that spawns a Dendro Core is a 2-hit attack, where it does 1 hit and then there's a resonance hit, so be careful not to get hit by that one. Fuck. Second wave is this guy. He's kind of annoying, but there's really not too much to say about him. He'll do an attack like this one. If you want to avoid the damage, you can run away from him. And then when he does it, you can go back. There's really not too much to say about him. It's a pretty straightforward enemy. Then you have the EM Drake. It starts on the ground with very high resistances. Then it goes up and starts flying. And you can knock, if you shoot its wings, you can knock it down. You can do your setup. Then you can shoot the wings. Oh, shoot the wings to knock it down.
No rest for the wicked.
And then you can start killing him. Now, if you take a while to kill him, so let me make sure I don't kill him just yet. He will do this, and if you shoot him here, you can prevent him from getting additional resistances. And then he'll go up in the air, and you can shoot it down again, if you want. Finally, last chamber. These guys do a lot of damage, and they're kind of annoying. If you want to group them very close together at the start, you can just run backwards. They'll move towards you a little bit, and then they'll burrow, and then... Okay, no, he decided not to. He'll do it now, yeah. And then they'll get close together like this. You might not need to, though. One thing that's really annoying is sometimes they decide to just burrow and then go back up, like, away from you. There's not really much you can do about that. If they do it, well, sucks to be you, honestly. But they won't do the burrow attack back to back. And so, if it's something that worries you, starting by grouping them like this is going to help you keep them more grouped. I don't want to talk about it. Second wave is the Aramite guy. He always starts by spawning his crocodile friend. If you kill the crocodile friend, it reduces his resistances and deals a lot of damage to him, so you should always try to target the crocodile friend first if you can. And that's pretty much it. Finally, against the Tulpa, if you're using Bennett, be careful not to die because you're gonna die. Making sure that you're not getting hit by any of the attacks is a pretty big deal. But as you can see, right? The Chevreuse team with Xiangling kind of does too much. Eventually he teleports away. Make sure you break these guys by triggering reactions on them. And then he's dead. I'm not going to kill him just yet. I want to showcase more of his attack patterns. If he teleports away, but his cooldown on absorbing one of the guys is still there, he'll try to hit you with his range attack like this. Careful that, like, pretty much all of his attacks does a lot of damage, especially if you're standing inside Bennett Burst. As much as Tulpa tends to hit really damn hard, his attacks are also very telegraphed and relatively easy to break. So here, right, you can prevent him from getting his thing. You take a little bit of damage from the little guys shooting at you over time, but it's really not too much damage. That's pretty much it! Overall, in terms of difficulty, I'd say that if you don't have a good team against Tulpa, this can be a bit harder than the previous Abyss, especially if you had a good team against the Geo Shields for the previous Abyss. However, as a general rule, it's, in my opinion, a decent amount easier. And this is the Xiangling ratio that was getting those numbers, right? We have around 160 something CV, a little bit under 170. Good amount of EM and attack though. But yeah, that pretty much does it for this Abyss cycle. I hope you enjoyed the meta roundup as usual. I hope you learned a thing or two. Mainly, I hope you learned that Xiangling is really good this Abyss. But also, hope you got an idea or two for which teams to use. That's pretty much it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.